December 1941. The world stood still in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Imperial Navy, having crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet with precision and ferocity, felt the heavy weight of triumph settling upon their shoulders. Victory, they believed, was only a matter of time. The Pacific would fall into their hands, an inevitable extension of their empire. Yet in their certainty, they had overlooked the most dangerous element of war, the resilience of the Americans they had just awakened. For Japan's commanders, the calculus was clear. America, they reasoned, would be too slow to rally its industrial machine. The vast distance across the Pacific would hinder any counterstrike, and the U.S. was still reeling from the surprise attack. What they failed to grasp was the depth of America's industrial might, the ability to adapt and overcome adversity. This was not a nation that would cower in the face of loss. This was a nation that would rebuild, retool, and fight back. The irony, of course, was that Japan's own brilliance, the precision of the Pearl Harbor attack, would soon become their greatest miscalculation. They had struck hard, but they had failed to consider the long game. Their initial victory at Pearl Harbor would, in the end, be a Pyrrhic one. In the months following the attack, Japan's overconfidence in its naval superiority led to a bold but perilous decision, an invasion of Midway Island. To the Japanese, this seemingly small outpost in the Pacific was little more than a stepping stone, an opportunity to finish off what was left of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But what Japan did not fully appreciate was that Midway, though seemingly a lesser objective, would soon become a battleground that would change the course of the war. As Japan's fleet moved forward, confident in their naval prowess, a quiet shift was taking place on the other side of the Pacific. The American response to Midway would expose Japan's fatal miscalculation, an underestimation of what the U.S. was truly capable of. And it would soon become clear that the war Japan thought would be over was only just beginning. What they didn't know was that at Midway, the tides of the Pacific were about to turn. In the early months of 1942, Japan's high command stood at a crossroads. With the Pacific in their grasp, they believed that America, stunned by the brutal attack on Pearl Harbor, would take months, perhaps even years, to recover. The vast distances, the loss of critical ships, and the initial shock all seemed to confirm Japan's assumptions. Victory was within their reach. The Pacific was theirs to command, but this was an assumption that would prove catastrophic. The Japanese, having dealt a powerful blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, misjudged the true nature of their enemy. Flawed intelligence led them to believe that America's industrial power, while vast, would take too long to mobilize. The American resolve, they thought, had been shattered. What they failed to understand was the unyielding spirit of the United States, its capacity not just to endure but to innovate, to adapt, and to retaliate. America's leaders knew the war was far from over. If anything, the attack on Pearl Harbor had done the opposite of what Japan had hoped. It had stirred an American resolve that would soon be unleashed in ways Japan could not anticipate. The irony was clear. The very success of Japan's attack, the devastation they had wrought, had been a galvanizing force for the United States. It sharpened the focus of American commanders and citizens alike. What Japan saw as a decisive blow only ignited a fire of retaliation, one that would soon burn through the Pacific. The question now was not whether America would strike back, but when and how. But Japan's misstep was more than strategic overconfidence. It was a blind spot. They had set their sights on Midway Island, a small but strategically vital outpost, intending to deliver a final blow to what remained of the U.S. Navy. Yet in their focus on this operation, they neglected to account for the one thing that would turn the tide in favor of the Americans, the codebreakers. As Japan moved toward Midway, a quiet, unseen battle was unfolding behind the scenes. U.S. codebreakers working in secret had intercepted and deciphered Japan's plans. The critical advantage was theirs. The tide was about to shift. What Japan didn't realize was that the speed of America's recovery would soon match the speed of their own downfall. The attack on Midway would not go as they expected, and by the time the battle unfolded, Japan's assumption would be exposed as a fatal flaw. In the summer of 1942, as Japan prepared to strike at Midway Island, the High Command believed they were about to deliver the final blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Their plan was simple: destroy the remaining American aircraft carriers and cripple the heart of their naval power. Midway, a small and seemingly inconsequential outpost, was to be the perfect a place to lure the U.S. forces into a trap. Japan's leadership had no inkling of the island's true value, seeing it as little more than a stepping stone. rather than the critical linchpin that would secure control of the Pacific. In their hubris, the Japanese miscalculated the strategic importance of Midway. They underestimated the island's role as a forward operating base for the U.S. Navy and the Air Forces. To them, it was a mere blip on the radar, an afterthought in their grand strategy. But the U.S. forces, despite being outnumbered and at a distinct disadvantage, were not only aware of Japan's plans, they were prepared to act on them. Through the work of the codebreakers, the Americans had decoded Japan's communications, and the element of surprise now rested with them. Japan's confidence was built on their numerical superiority and decades of naval experience. They believed their tactics, their fleet of aircraft, and their seasoned commanders would be enough to ensure victory. They could not have been more wrong. What Japan did not know, however, was that their overconfidence would soon meet a strategic counterpunch that would alter the course of the war. The American forces, now armed with vital intelligence, prepared for the coming confrontation. In the skies, on the waters, and within their command rooms, the U.S. Navy's response was swift and precise. Japan's own trap, designed to decimate the American fleet, would soon snap shut on them. Midway was not simply a military base. It was the fulcrum that would tip the balance of the Pacific. Japan's failure to recognize this would be their undoing. What they had thought of as a small victory would become the catalyst for their greatest defeat. But as Japan's fleet closed in, the Americans, with their code-breaking advantage, were already setting their own trap. The battle for Midway was about to begin, and the outcome was already determined in the shadows of intercepted signals. In the summer of 1942, the Japanese Navy stood poised at the height of its power, preparing to strike at Midway Island. The commanders, having tasted victory after victory across the Pacific, were certain of their success. Their fleet was vast, their aircraft superior, and their numbers overwhelming. In their minds, the outcome was never in doubt. Midway would fall, the U.S. Navy would be crippled, and Japan's dominance over the Pacific would be assured. This confidence was not born from arrogance alone, but from a carefully constructed belief in their superiority, one rooted in the failures of their enemies. What Japan's commanders could not foresee, however, was the devastating power of American ingenuity. Though the U.S. had suffered a grievous blow at Pearl Harbor, their capacity to adapt was unparalleled. The same America they had sought to cripple now stood on the edge of reclaiming its strength. The advantage, once thought to rest with Japan, had shifted in ways they could not have imagined. Through sheer determination and innovation, the U.S. had rebuilt its fleet, upgraded its aircraft, and most crucially, gained a significant advantage in intelligence. While Japan's commanders were fixated on the battle itself, the Americans were already preparing a strategic counterattack, armed with the kind of information that would leave their enemies blind. The irony of the situation was stark. Despite their superiority in the field of battle, Japan's greatest miscalculation lay in their failure to understand the full extent of American resolve and their underestimated capacity for tactical brilliance. The U.S. Navy, once crippled, was now prepared to strike with precision. Intelligence gathered by America's codebreakers had provided a clear picture of Japan's intentions, and with this knowledge, the Americans were ready to turn the tide. Still, the Japanese commanders, while confident, were not entirely blind to the risks they were taking. A few among them raised concerns about the dangers of overextending their forces. Yet these voices were drowned out by the belief that Japan's superiority in aircraft, ships, and experience would be enough to guarantee victory. The truth was, the Japanese were so certain of their success that they failed to consider the possibility that their greatest strength, overwhelming force, might be precisely what would lead to their undoing. And so, with the full might of their fleet in motion, the Japanese Navy moved toward Midway. They had set the stage for a decisive battle, confident in their ability to crush the Americans. But what they didn't know was that the very intelligence they had overlooked would soon become their greatest vulnerability. They were walking into a trap they never saw coming. In the depths of the Pacific, the Americans were preparing to turn the tables. In June of 1942, as the U.S. Navy made its final preparations for the impending battle at Midway, a sense of quiet determination filled the air. The Americans knew they faced an uphill struggle. They were outnumbered, under-resourced, and still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. But there was something the Japanese did not understand. Their disadvantage in numbers could be mitigated by the power of intelligence, strategy, and most importantly, resolve. The Americans believed that their ability to strike decisively would make up for what they lacked in sheer force. It was a gamble, but they were prepared to take it. As Japan's fleet sailed toward Midway, their commanders remained confident. They had long believed that their superior numbers, firepower, and experience would be enough to overwhelm the Americans. Yet, what they did not know was that the very intelligence they had dismissed would soon shatter their assumptions. The U.S. Navy, armed with a knowledge of Japan's movements and intentions, had already prepared their counterattack. What had once seemed like a perfectly orchestrated operation was about to be undone by the information Japan never knew they had handed over. For the U.S. Navy, the stakes were immense. The scars of Pearl Harbor were still fresh, and the pressure to avenge the loss of so many men and ships hung heavily on their shoulders. They had lost much, but they had not lost everything. The battle for Midway would be their moment to prove that even the most powerful enemy could be defeated with determination, intelligence, and a willingness to fight against the odds. They were under no illusions. They had no time to waste, no luxury of failure. Every aircraft, every bomb, every ship was a fragile thread in a desperate tapestry. If they failed now, the Pacific War could spiral beyond their control. The irony of it all was profound. Japan, certain of its superiority, had overlooked the one weapon that would undo them: knowledge. America's codebreakers had intercepted their plans, and this intelligence now gave the U.S. forces a remarkable advantage. With this advantage, the Americans were poised to strike when the Japanese fleet least expected it. The Japanese had assumed their superiority in firepower and experience would guarantee their success. But what they failed to account for was that the Americans, though seemingly weaker, had a weapon far more powerful than brute force: the ability to strike precisely when it mattered most. The turning point came swiftly. U.S. bombers, launched from carriers still concealed by the vastness of the Pacific, descended on Japan's fleet. In the chaos of battle, they struck critical blows against the Japanese carriers, shattering their decks, crippling their air power, and exposing their vulnerabilities. It was a moment of clarity in the storm of war. The tide of battle was shifting. As Japan's carriers burned, the U.S. Navy demonstrated that intelligence, strategy, and bravery could overcome an enemy's numerical advantage. The Americans had seized the initiative, and what had once seemed like an impossible dream was becoming a terrifying reality for the Japanese. But as the battle raged, the question remained: would the U.S. Navy be able to hold the line, or would the tide turn once again? In the midst of this furious conflict, a new force was about to make its mark. By mid-June 1942, as the battle for Midway reached its peak, Japan believed they had the upper hand. They had always known that attrition would be the key to victory in a long war, and their fleet's numerical superiority seemed to promise just that. The Japanese Navy was vast and battle-hardened, its ranks filled with seasoned warriors and powerful aircraft. The Americans, in contrast, were still recovering from the devastation of Pearl Harbor, their resources stretched thin. For the Japanese, the fight was one of patience and endurance, confident that the sheer weight of their forces would eventually grind down the Americans. Yet as the hours turned into days and the battle raged on, Japan's assumption began to unravel. Though outnumbered, the U.S. Navy began to inflict devastating losses on the Japanese fleet, striking with a precision and determination that exceeded anything the Japanese had anticipated. American aircraft, launched from carriers hidden in the vastness of the Pacific, began to punch through Japan's defenses with surprising force. What had started as a fight of attrition soon turned into a nightmare for the Japanese. Each strike, each bomb, each torpedo landed with terrifying accuracy, and the Japanese fleet was forced to confront a truth they had not considered: their numerical edge could not guarantee them victory. The struggle now was not just about sinking ships, but about surviving a relentless American assault that seemed to exploit every strategic mistake the Japanese made. The Japanese Navy, long accustomed to dominating the seas, now found themselves reeling. Their careful plans, crafted with meticulous precision, were being torn apart by the very force they had underestimated: the adaptability of their enemy. The U.S. Navy, though initially battered, had learned from their past mistakes and now fought with an intensity that shook Japan's confidence to its core. The tide of the battle was shifting, and Japan's failure to adjust quickly was proving to be their undoing. The irony of the situation was hard to ignore. Despite their initial dominance in the battle, Japan's inability to adapt to the rapidly changing circumstances began to cost them dearly. Their carefully laid plans were undone by their own overconfidence. and their failure to anticipate the full capabilities of the U.S. forces left them vulnerable to an attack they could neither predict nor prevent. The turning point came when American bombers, acting with astonishing precision, struck the heart of Japan's fleet. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, three of Japan's most powerful carriers, were destroyed in quick succession, and with them, the foundation of Japan's naval superiority began to collapse. By the time Japan realized the full extent of their miscalculations, it was too late. The destruction of their carriers marked the beginning of the unraveling of their fleet. The war of attrition they had counted on had turned against them, and in the depths of the Pacific, a new reality was setting in. Japan had underestimated the Americans' resolve, their intelligence, and their ability to adapt. But the Americans were already one step ahead. What Japan failed to recognize was that their overconfidence had given the U.S. Navy the time and space to turn the tide in their favor. The battle for Midway was far from over, but one thing was already clear. The Japanese would never recover from the blow they had just suffered. As the American forces prepared for the next phase of the battle, the Japanese commanders were left to question how they could possibly reverse their course. On the morning of June 4, 1942, as the battle for Midway reached its climax, the skies above the Pacific became the stage for one of the most intense and decisive air battles of the war. For the U.S. Navy, this was the moment that would determine the outcome of everything they had fought for since Pearl Harbor. Outnumbered and outclassed in many ways, the American pilots and bombers faced a daunting task: destroy the heart of the Japanese fleet, or watch their hopes of turning the tide in the Pacific slip away. It was a battle that would be won not just by firepower, but by courage, innovation, and sheer will. The struggle began with waves of American bombers and torpedo planes, launching relentless attacks on the Japanese carriers despite heavy losses. With each mission, the U.S. forces suffered, but the more they fought, the more they adapted. The Japanese fleet, vast and powerful, seemed impenetrable at first, yet the Americans did not relent. Pilots made aggressive bombing runs, flying dangerously close to their targets, pushing their planes to the limits. They knew that this was not a battle that could be won with conventional tactics. The Japanese fleet, expertly protected by fighters, seemed invulnerable, but the Americans, with fewer resources, would turn the tide through innovation. U.S. pilots quickly realized that success lay not in brute force, but in exploiting the Japanese fleet's vulnerabilities. Using their knowledge of the enemy's weaknesses, they began to adjust their tactics, targeting the blind spots of the Japanese carriers and seeking out weak points in their defenses. The torpedo planes, in particular, flew perilous low-level attacks, skimming just above the waves to launch their deadly payloads. The risk was immense. The chances of survival were slim. But each pilot knew that failure meant the end of the war effort, and so they pushed forward with relentless determination. The irony of it all was stark. Despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and often outclassed, the U.S. forces displayed an ingenuity and resilience that would become the defining feature of the battle. The Japanese, whose fleet had been built with the assumption of superiority, were now forced to confront an enemy that refused to be beaten. The American pilots were not just fighting with bombs and torpedoes, they were fighting with intelligence and sheer audacity. Every attack on the Japanese carriers was a calculated risk, every maneuver a testament to their understanding of their enemy's capabilities and their own limitations. As the battle intensified, the pressure mounted on both sides. Japanese fighter planes ascended into the skies, determined to repel the U.S. bombers and torpedo planes. The sky became a theater of chaos as both sides fought for control of the air. Yet, despite the Japanese fighters' superiority in numbers and speed, the Americans continued their attacks, weaving through the storm of bullets and explosions. They struck at the heart of Japan's fleet, targeting the carriers and exposing their vulnerabilities. The turning point came when U.S. bombers, having suffered significant losses, managed land critical blows on the Japanese carriers. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, three of Japan's most powerful carriers, were destroyed in swift succession, sending shockwaves through the Japanese fleet. The Japanese fighters, once poised to dominate the skies, now found themselves struggling to defend their ships. The carriers they had once relied on were burning, sinking, and taking with them the heart of Japan's naval power. In the midst of this relentless assault, the U.S. forces demonstrated something that went beyond mere numbers and firepower. It was adaptability, ingenuity, and the will to fight against seemingly insurmountable odds. The battle for Midway was not just about destroying ships. It was about adapting to a new kind of warfare, one in which both sides would have to learn from each engagement, adjusting their strategies in real time. The Japanese had underestimated the Americans' ability to innovate under pressure, and now the very sky they had once dominated was turning against them. As the U.S. forces continued their assault, the realization grew clear. The battle for Midway had become a turning point not only in numbers, but in tactics. The Americans had shown that intelligence, creativity, and sheer courage could overcome the limitations of their resources. But as the Japanese fleet continued to burn, one question lingered in the air. Would this moment of triumph be enough to change the course of the Pacific War, or would Japan find a way to recover from the losses they had sustained? In the distance, beyond the horizon, the battle was far from over. But for now, the skies belonged to the Americans. On June 4, 1942, as the battle for Midway reached its critical moment, the Japanese fleet, once seen as an unstoppable force, found itself under relentless assault from American bombers. The Japanese carriers, protected by layers of escorting fighters, had long been considered the heart of their naval power. With their sleek designs and formidable air wings, the carriers were meant to control the Pacific skies. But even the most powerful fleets have their vulnerabilities. And it was in those vulnerabilities that the Americans found their opening. As the American bombers dove through the clouded skies toward the Japanese fleet, the first bombs struck their targets with deadly precision. The U.S. pilots had carefully studied Japan's fleet and learned the weaknesses the Japanese had failed to address. The fighters, deployed to defend the carriers, swarmed the sky in frantic defense, but the sheer number of American bombers was overwhelming. As the American torpedo bombers descended, the Japanese Navy found itself in the grip of a nightmare they could not escape. Despite the fighters' valiant efforts to ward off the bombers, the carriers were increasingly exposed. The bombers pushed through, their torpedoes cutting through the water with a brutal finality, delivering hits that would forever change the course of the war. The Japanese, in their confidence, had underestimated the destructive potential of the American assault. They believed that their fleet, with its superior size and strength, could easily ward off any attack. They had designed their aircraft to carry out powerful strikes against enemies, but they had failed to adequately protect their own fleet from bombing raids. This oversight, born from overconfidence, would prove to be their greatest mistake. The Americans were relentless, their aircraft flying through intense fire to drop their bombs with remarkable precision, hitting the very heart of Japan's naval power. The irony was glaring. Japan, whose superiority in naval aviation had once seemed invincible, now faced the harsh reality of vulnerability. Their aircraft carriers, once the pinnacle of naval dominance, were now the target of a calculated and devastating assault. The very strength that had been their advantage had become their weakness, and it was a weakness the Americans exploited to devastating effect. For all their planning, for all their confidence, the Japanese had failed to recognize that their greatest strength, their fleet, was also their greatest liability. The turning point came when, in rapid succession, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, three of Japan's most powerful carriers, were struck and engulfed in flames. The Akagi, flagship of the Japanese fleet, was the first to fall. The Kaga followed swiftly, then the Soryu. In an instant, the Japanese Navy was crippled. The heart of their fleet, the carriers that had formed the core of their naval strategy, was burning, sinking, and taking with it the hopes of victory in the Pacific. The Japanese, unable to recover from such a loss, were left floundering, their once imposing fleet reduced to chaos. The destruction of these carriers had not come by accident. The Americans had sacrificed much to ensure that these vital ships would be destroyed. It was not just the bravery of the pilots who risked everything to launch the attacks, no. Or the precision of their bombing runs, it was the willingness to sacrifice lives, to press the attack even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The American forces had known that to strike at the Japanese fleet, they would need to risk everything. And they did. Each bomb, each torpedo, each man who flew into the jaws of death was part of a larger, calculated plan to turn the tide of the war. This collective sacrifice became the foundation of their victory. As the Japanese carriers burned, the Americans realized the true cost of their victory. They had not only destroyed ships, they had shattered Japan's ability to continue the war in the Pacific. The destruction of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu was not just a military setback. It was a psychological blow from which Japan's navy could not recover. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted, and with it, the fate of the war. But the question remained. Could the Japanese recover from such a blow, or was this the beginning of the end for their dominance in the Pacific? The battle was not over, but it had already become clear that the Japanese fleet would never be the same again. And as the smoke rose from the wreckage of the carriers, the Americans prepared for the next wave, their resolve unwavering. They had struck at the heart of the enemy, and now they had to press their advantage. As the Battle of Midway stretched into its final hours on June 4th, the Japanese fleet, once confident and imposing, was now crippled and scattered. Despite the devastation wrought upon them, Japan's remaining forces tried desperately to regroup, hoping that a decisive counterattack might still turn the tide. Their carriers, the core of their naval might, were burning on the horizon, but their commanders refused to acknowledge that their once unbeatable fleet was now a shadow of its former self. They pressed on, stubbornly clinging to traditional tactics that had served them so well in the past. But these tactics, once formidable, now only hastened their downfall. For the U.S. Navy, the moment of reckoning was at hand. Despite their own heavy losses and the uncertainty that had surrounded their initial attacks, the Americans pressed forward with grim determination. Their success at Midway had already shifted the balance of the Pacific, but it was not enough to simply wound the enemy. The Japanese fleet, though faltering, was still a threat. The U.S. Navy knew that they had to eliminate it completely, or risk the possibility of a protracted war that could still go against them. Now, with the intelligence they had gained, they understood their enemy's weaknesses and were prepared to strike with the precision and speed that had already been so effective. As the hours wore on, Japan's continued reliance on traditional tactics only worked to its detriment. The Japanese, despite their growing desperation, were unable to adapt to the changing dynamics of the battle. Their once mighty air force had been decimated, and their remaining fighters, though valiant, could no longer fend off the relentless onslaught of U.S. bombers. The refusal to adjust to the Americans' innovations, those very innovations that had taken advantage of their vulnerabilities, sealed Japan's fate. The Japanese command failed to see that the war they were fighting now was not one of brute strength, but one of strategy, adaptation, and sheer will to win. And then in the afternoon of June 4th, the final blow came. A squadron of U.S. dive bombers, armed with precision and intent, swooped down on the Hurryu, Japan's last remaining aircraft carrier. The dive bombers, having learned from the mistakes of earlier engagements, delivered their payloads with deadly accuracy. The Hurryu, though valiantly defending itself, could not withstand the barrage. Explosions rocked the deck, and fires quickly spread through the ship. The Japanese, with no carriers left to launch planes from, were now unable to continue the fight. They had lost the backbone of their naval power in one swift, devastating attack. The irony of the moment was not lost on anyone. Japan's reliance on conventional strategies and their belief in the invulnerability of their fleet had blinded them to the new realities of modern warfare. They had been outflanked not by overwhelming numbers, but by intelligence, innovation, and an ability to adapt under pressure. The Americans had struck at the heart of Japan's naval strength, and with the destruction of the Hurryu, the Japanese fleet was no longer a cohesive force. The battle that had begun as a struggle for survival for the U.S. Navy had now become an overwhelming victory. Japan's superiority in numbers, their focus on brute strength, had been undone by the ingenuity and resolve of the American forces. The Battle of Midway, with its sudden and dramatic turn of events, would become a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in the nature of warfare itself. Strategy and innovation had overcome sheer force. The U.S. Navy had not simply won. They had reshaped the rules of naval combat. It was no longer enough to rely on superior numbers or tactics that had worked in the past. The battle had demonstrated that intelligence, adaptability, and the will to fight against overwhelming odds were the true keys to victory. As the smoke of the Hurryu's final moments rose into the sky, the fate of the Pacific had been sealed. Japan's naval forces, once the most powerful in the world, were left in ruins. The Battle of Midway would forever be remembered as the moment when the tide of the Pacific War turned, and with it, the future of the war itself. The Japanese, defeated and disorganized, would never recover their former dominance. And as the Americans stood victorious, they knew that this was only the beginning. The battle had been won, but the war, long and hard, was still ahead. But in the distance, beyond the horizon, the Japanese were already regrouping. The war was not over, and yet the Americans had just shown that they were prepared for whatever came next. By mid-June 1942, the full weight of the Battle of Midway had settled over the Pacific, and the reverberations of defeat reached the furthest corners of the Japanese Empire. The once unbeatable Japanese fleet, the pride of their naval might, lay in ruins. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, four of their most powerful aircraft carriers, had been destroyed, and with them the backbone of Japan's naval strength. The devastation was not just military, it was psychological. For Japan's high command, it was an impossible blow, a loss that no amount of strategic planning could mitigate. The struggle, once thought to be theirs to win, had now irrevocably tilted in the favor of the Americans. Japan's miscalculations, particularly their overestimation of U.S. weaknesses, had led them down a path of vulnerability. For months, they had believed that the United States, though wounded, would be incapable of striking back effectively. They had expected the Americans to falter in their efforts to recover from the losses at Pearl Harbor, underestimating the resolve and adaptability that would soon define the U.S. response. Midway, however, shattered this assumption in one stroke. The Americans, armed with intelligence and a willingness to fight against overwhelming odds, had turned the tables with precision and innovation. The battle revealed a fundamental flaw in Japan's strategy. They had based their decisions on an outdated belief in their invincibility, ignoring the rapidly changing nature of modern warfare. Midway was more than a battle. It was the moment when Japan's naval supremacy, once thought unshakable, began to unravel. The Japanese had long believed that their carriers, supported by an elite air force, could control the Pacific. But that belief was built on an assumption of dominance that had no place in the harsh new reality of the war. In the span of just a few days, Japan lost not only its fleet's heart, but also the strategic initiative. Their fleet, shattered and broken, could no longer match the speed or the agility of the U.S. Navy, which now held the upper hand in both intelligence and tactical innovation. The irony of the situation was striking. Japan's military planners, confident in their superior numbers and experience, had underestimated the power of intelligence and strategic adaptation. Their reliance on sheer force, their focus on overwhelming their opponents with brute strength, had led to their downfall. In contrast, the Americans had leveraged every advantage they had: superior intelligence, precise strikes, and the courage to take risks when the stakes were highest. It was a battle that was not won through might alone, but through an understanding of the evolving nature of warfare. The Japanese, despite their early victories, had been outmaneuvered by a force they failed to understand: the power of strategic intelligence and adaptability. In the aftermath of Midway, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. Japan's failure to adapt to the changing tide of war would prove fatal. The once proud fleet, which had been the cornerstone of Japan's imperial ambitions, was now severely crippled. More than just the loss of ships and men, the destruction of their carriers represented a blow to Japan's very ability to project power across the vast Pacific. They were no longer the uncontested rulers of the sea. The United States had seized the initiative, and the path to victory in the Pacific was now wide open. What had seemed like a small, isolated battle, Midway, a seemingly insignificant island in the grand scheme of the Pacific, had turned into the pivotal moment of the war. In a single stroke, the U.S. Navy had dealt a blow so powerful that Japan would never recover from it. The loss of 4 carriers in the span of just a few days was not simply a military setback. It was the turning point in a conflict that would drag on for 3 more years. The America. NS had not just defeated Japan at Midway. They had opened the door to a new phase of the war, one where the initiative was firmly in American hands. Japan's inability to adapt to the changing realities of warfare, to recognize that their own weaknesses had been exposed, sealed their fate. They had fought for dominance on the open seas, but what they failed to realize was that the future of war would belong to those who could outthink their enemies, who could innovate and adjust as the conflict evolved. It was a lesson Japan would learn too late. The Battle of Midway had sealed their defeat. In the days that followed, as Japan's shattered fleet limped back home, it became clear that the war in the Pacific was no longer a question of if the Americans would win, but when. Midway had changed everything. The Japanese had lost not just a battle, but their strategic advantage in the Pacific. From that moment on, the tide would only turn further against them. But even as Japan began to reckon with its loss, the Americans were preparing for the next stage of their campaign. Would the Japanese fleet regroup and find a way to regain the initiative? Or had the Battle of Midway truly marked the beginning of the end for Japan in the Pacific? In the distance, beyond the horizon, the next battles were already taking shape. In the months following the Battle of Midway, Japan found itself grappling with the consequences of its hubris. The loss of four of its most powerful aircraft carriers was not just a military setback, it was a devastating blow to the core of its naval power. These carriers, the pride of Japan's fleet, had been the cornerstone of their strategy in the Pacific, and now they were gone. With no time to mourn, the Japanese fleet scrambled to rebuild, but the damage was far deeper than what could be repaired with new ships and planes. The momentum had shifted, and Japan's naval dominance, once unchallenged, was now a distant memory. The struggle to recover from Midway was intense, but the Japanese were at a severe disadvantage. They could not undo the devastating losses of their carriers, and worse still, they could not regain the tactical advantage they once enjoyed. The U.S. Navy, having seized the initiative, began to press its advantage relentlessly. Japan's inability to adjust quickly to this new reality, compounded by their stubborn overconfidence, only accelerated their losses. The Japanese high command, clinging to outdated strategies and underestimating the will and innovation of their enemy, failed to adapt in a rapidly evolving war. Where they should have been rethinking their tactics, they were instead focused on rebuilding what had been lost, as though they could simply pick up where they had left off. The irony of Japan's situation was stark. Despite their considerable efforts to rebuild their fleet and recover from Midway, they could never regain the advantage they had lost. The carriers, once the key to their strategy, were gone, and the Americans, with their growing fleet and superior intelligence, were moving quickly to replace them. Japan's new ships, though powerful, could not fill the gaping hole left by the destruction of their carriers. The psychological blow was just as severe. The Japanese no longer held the same level of confidence in their own superiority. Every victory they had once claimed, every island they had conquered, now seemed more tenuous in light of the irreversible change brought about at Midway. As the U.S. Navy began to capitalize on its momentum, Japan found itself on the defensive. The Americans, now fully aware of their newfound strength, pressed forward with a series of well-coordinated attacks that brought them closer and closer to the heart of the Pacific. The momentum from Midway was undeniable. Japan's setbacks mounted with each passing month, as U.S. forces struck island after island, slowly but surely dismantling Japan's perimeter. The tide had turned in the Pacific, and with each new victory, it became increasingly clear that the future of the war would not be decided by Japan's fleet, but by the persistence and resolve of the U.S. Navy. The turning point had been Midway. What had once seemed like a small, isolated battle now loomed as the defining moment of the war in the Pacific. It was not just a defeat for Japan. It was the unraveling of their entire strategic position. The Japanese fleet, though not yet completely destroyed, was on its last legs. Their inability to recover from the blow dealt at Midway proved fatal. The Americans, by contrast, had learned from their mistakes, adapted their tactics, and pressed forward with a clarity of purpose that left little room for Japanese hope. As 1943 dawned, Japan's position in the Pacific was increasingly untenable. Despite their best efforts to rebuild, the Americans were now firmly in control of the momentum. The Japanese Navy, though still formidable in some respects, was no longer the dominant force it once was. As the U.S. Navy, having reclaimed the initiative, now moved steadily toward victory, with each victory reinforcing the lesson that Midway had taught them. Intelligence, adaptability, and resilience would prove far more decisive than the brute force on which Japan had once relied. In the shadow of Midway, Japan found itself desperately trying to hold on to a war that was slipping further from its grasp. The sacrifices made by the U.S. forces in that battle, the countless lives, the innovation, the strategic risks, had turned the tide. Now the Japanese could only hope for a miracle, but the writing was on the wall. The momentum had shifted, and every day that passed saw Japan's position in the Pacific weaken further. The Battle of Midway had been a single battle in a long war, but its consequences would resonate far beyond that day. What began as a disastrous defeat for the Americans would soon become a symbol of their resilience. Midway had been the moment the U.S. Navy had turned the war on its head, and now, in the face of Japan's ongoing struggle to regroup, the path to ultimate victory was becoming ever clearer. But Japan's failure to adapt was a costly one. Would they be able to adjust in time, or had they already sealed their fate? As the U.S. Navy moved forward, Japan was left to ponder a critical question. Was it too late to recover, or had Midway marked the beginning of the end? The answer, as the war would soon reveal, was already unfolding. By 1943, the full weight of the Battle of Midway had come to rest upon the shoulders of the Japanese Empire. The shockwaves of their defeat rippled through their strategic calculations, unraveling the once immense confidence they had held over their campaign in the Pacific. Japan's inability to recover from the loss of 4 of their most powerful aircraft carriers, combined with the failure to anticipate the resilience of the U.S. military, set in motion a series of events that would lead to their strategic collapse. The Americans, having seized the initiative, were now in command of the Pacific theater, shifting the momentum of the war irreparably in their favor. The irony of Japan's situation was profound. Their greatest miscalculation, the one that had seemed so inconsequential at the time, had now become the reason for their ultimate defeat. For months, Japan had underestimated the United States, their resilience, their ingenuity, and their ability to recover after suffering staggering losses. What the Japanese had believed to be an incapacitated enemy was now a force that was steadily gaining strength and precision. The battle at Midway had exposed not only Japan's vulnerabilities, but also the enormous capacity of the U.S. military to adapt, innovate, and execute under pressure. Midway was the breaking point where Japan's overconfidence and strategic blindness met the harsh realities of war. As 1943 unfolded, the U.S. Navy no longer waited for Japan to make the first move. They took the war to the enemy. The Pacific had been Japan's domain for years, but now the United States was no longer reacting. The Americans had shifted from a defensive stance to an offensive one, dictating the terms of battle. Midway had proven that the U.S. could take on the Japanese fleet and win, but it also demonstrated that the Japanese could be outmaneuvered and defeated. With Midway behind them, the U.S. Navy began to press forward with a clear sense of purpose, launching assaults on Japanese-held islands and progressively weakening their grip on the Pacific. It was no longer a question of whether the United States would recover, but when Japan's position would collapse. The momentum was now firmly on the American side. The very thing Japan had relied upon, its overwhelming naval strength, had been shattered, and in the wake of Midway, the Japanese high command struggled to comprehend the depth of the disaster they had endured. Even as they scrambled to rebuild, they found themselves confronted with a new reality. The Americans were not only capable of recovering quickly, but also adept at innovation and exploitation of weaknesses. The Japanese, having once been masters of the seas, now faced an enemy that had learned from its mistakes and was adapting faster than they could counter. The turning point, however, was not merely the battle itself, but what it represented, a fundamental shift in the balance of power. In the past, Japan had dictated the terms of engagement, relying on their superior tactics, their fleet of carriers, and their seasoned pilots. But now, the United States was no longer merely reacting. They were pushing forward with relentless precision. Japan's failures at Midway were not just tactical but strategic, and their inability to adjust would be their undoing. The Japanese high command failed to recognize that the future of warfare would not be won by brute force alone, but by the ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, a lesson they would learn too. Late, as the United States began to systematically retake the Pacific Islands, one after another, Japan's strategic position deteriorated. What had once seemed like an unbreakable fortress, a network of islands stretching across the Pacific, began to collapse. The Japanese military, bogged down in an endless war of attrition, could no longer sustain the offensive. Their once dominant naval force had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, and now the Japanese were forced to fight on multiple fronts, each one more desperate than the last. What had once been a war of expansion for Japan was now a struggle for survival. The revelation was clear. Japan had underestimated the resilience of the United States, believing that they could simply overwhelm their enemies with sheer strength and speed. But the U.S. had demonstrated something Japan had failed to understand: the importance of intelligence, adaptability, and innovation. It was these qualities that now allowed the United States to dictate the terms of battle and slowly drive Japan into a corner from which there would be no escape. Midway, once viewed as a small battle, now stood as the symbolic moment when Japan's strategy faltered and their grip on the Pacific slipped away. In the wake of Midway, the U.S. Navy's march toward victory continued, with every victory adding to the momentum. Japan's failure to adapt to the changing nature of warfare, their overconfidence in their fleet, and their inability to recognize the evolving threat posed by the Americans sealed their fate. They had failed to learn the lessons of the war, and by the time they realized their mistakes, the tide had already turned. The strategic collapse of Japan, once thought impossible, was now inevitable. As the Americans pressed forward, their path clear, Japan was left to confront the harsh reality of their overreach. Could they recover, or was this the beginning of the end for their empire? The answer, though not yet fully realized, was already taking shape on the battlefield. By 1944, the full weight of Japan's earlier miscalculations in the Pacific had come crashing down upon them. The remnants of their once dominant fleet were now scattered across the ocean, their islands increasingly isolated and vulnerable to the advancing American forces. Every battle, every confrontation, seemed to echo the same lesson that had begun at Midway. Japan had underestimated the resolve, adaptability, and capability of the United States. What had once seemed like a minor setback for the U.S. Navy now stood as the defining moment of the Pacific conflict, and Japan was paying the price for its arrogance in the most profound way. Japan's failure to recognize the U.S. as a capable adversary had shaped every phase of the war. For years, the Japanese command had assumed that their strength would be enough to overwhelm their enemies, that their fleet, their tactics, and their war machine were simply too powerful to be stopped. But what Midway revealed, and what became clearer with every subsequent battle, was that the United States, though wounded, was not an enemy that could be crushed by sheer force alone. The Americans had learned from their losses, adapted, and developed new strategies that put Japan on the back foot. By the time 1944 arrived, the U.S. had begun its final push towards Japan's homeland, and there was no longer any question of who held the initiative. The turning point had come in 1942 at Midway, but by 1944, Japan was feeling the full weight of that fateful miscalculation. What had once seemed like a triumph of military might, the idea that Japan could outlast and overpower its enemies, was now revealed to be a fundamental weakness. The Japanese had failed to account for the resilience of their adversaries, for the ingenuity of the American military, and for the unrelenting resolve that had been forged in the fires of battle. Now, as the Allied forces closed in on Japan, every skirmish, every campaign, was a reminder that the price of underestimating the enemy was not just defeat, but annihilation. The irony of Japan's situation was profound. Their arrogance at Midway had set the course for their ultimate downfall. They had believed that their fleet was invulnerable, that their tactics would always triumph, and that the United States, still reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor, could never pose a true threat. But the very battle that Japan thought would secure their dominance in the Pacific had, in fact, marked the beginning of their collapse. As the war dragged on, the U.S. Navy and its allies had used that underestimation as fuel for their relentless march forward. Each victory, each island taken, was a reaffirmation of the lessons learned at Midway. Japan's failures to adapt and adjust to the new realities of modern warfare would now cost them dearly. The final push toward Japan had begun, and it was clear that Japan could no longer defend its empire. The U.S. Navy, strengthened by years of experience, technological advancement, and strategic innovation, now held the upper hand in every engagement. The Allied forces were not just fighting for control of islands or sea lanes. They were fighting to bring the war to Japan's doorstep. The sheer scale of the American military effort was overwhelming. The Japanese, unable to replenish their fleet or adapt their strategies, watched helplessly as their empire crumbled under the weight of American power. What had begun as a series of incremental victories for the United States was now a crescendo, a full-scale offensive that would ultimately lead to Japan's defeat. Every attack, every offensive, seemed to drive home the same message. Japan's inability to adjust to the changing nature of warfare, their failure to learn from their early missteps, was what allowed the United States to march toward victory. The war's ultimate lesson was clear. In war, as in life, to underestimate your enemy is to invite your own destruction. Japan had made that fatal mistake at Midway, and they had never fully recovered. The moral of the war was no longer just about military tactics or the number of ships sunk or islands taken. It was about understanding the full scope of your enemy's potential, recognizing the value of adaptability, and never underestimating the will to fight. Midway had shown the world the incredible power of resilience, of intelligence, and of innovation. It was not Japan's strength that had led them to this point, but their failure to acknowledge the strength of the United States. And as the Allies closed in on Japan's heart, it was clear that the cost of underestimating the enemy was not merely a lost battle. It was the collapse of an empire. But even as Japan's final days approached, the question remained: would they recognize their mistakes too late, or would they fight to the bitter end? The answer was already unfolding, one battle at a time. In the years following the end of World War II, the victory at Midway, though widely acknowledged by military historians, began to fade from public memory. The larger narrative of the war, with its sprawling campaigns across Europe and the dramatic conclusion of the atomic bombings, overshadowed the quiet significance of Midway. In the collective consciousness, it was the battles that led to the surrender of Nazi Germany, or the fall of Tokyo, that captured the imagination of the world. Midway, despite being the turning point in the Pacific, became a historical footnote, its monumental importance lost in the broader scope of the war's final chapters. Yet, for those who fought there, its significance never waned. The irony of Midway's place in history is profound. While it decisively shifted the tide of the Pacific War, securing the initiative for the United States and heralding the beginning of Japan's slow retreat, the battle is often overshadowed by the later stages of the war. The struggles in the European theater, the drama of D-Day, the rise of the Allies, and the eventual conclusion in the Pacific all became the more visible moments that defined the public's understanding of World War II. Midway, though monumental, slipped into the background, its relevance obscured by the grand sweep of history. The irony lies in how one of the most pivotal moments in military history could be eclipsed by the grandeur of the conflict's conclusion. For the veterans who fought at Midway, however, the battle remained a defining moment of their lives. They would recall the terror of the initial bombardment, the confusion of the early hours, and the exhilaration of seeing Japan's carriers go up in flames. Yet, they also carried with them a sense of being part of something that was not fully recognized, at least not in the years that followed. The veterans of Midway knew that their victory had not only crippled Japan's fleet, but had turned the course of the war in ways the world could scarcely comprehend at the time. They had been the architects of a shift in history, but in the post-war years, their contributions, along with the importance of Midway itself, became distant echoes in the larger narrative of global conflict. The victory at Midway was an unrecognized turning point for much of the world. The battle was fought and won in a matter of days, yet its long-lasting effects would echo throughout the Pacific. The Japanese fleet, shattered and diminished, would never recover. The U.S. Navy, having gained control of the skies and seas, would not only defend but drive forward with a relentless series of offensives that would eventually bring Japan to its knees. Midway, however, did not come with a grand victory parade. It was a quiet, strategic victory that would only be fully understood by those who lived through it. For the men who fought there, it was their story to carry, their victory to cherish, but also their burden to bear, unrecognized by a world that had its sights set on the war's final moments. The true impact of Midway is clear, though often overlooked. It was the moment that broke the back of Japan's naval supremacy, the key that unlocked the path to ultimate victory in the Pacific. Yet its legacy is rarely discussed in the same breath as the larger milestones of the war. While the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki sealed Japan's fate, it was Midway that first paved the way for the decisive conclusion. It was Midway that proved the American resolve, demonstrated the value of intelligence, and exemplified the power of strategic adaptation in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. For the veterans of the battle, Midway remains one of the war's most critical moments, despite the world's tendency to look past it. They fought not for recognition, but for survival and for the greater cause of peace. The lessons learned at Midway about innovation, resilience, and the unpredictability of war remain as relevant today as they were then. Midway did not just change the war. It changed the course of history, teaching the world that sometimes the smallest battles can have the most significant impact. The legacy of Midway, though fading from public memory, lives on in the victories that followed. It is carried in the triumph of the U.S. Navy, the relentless forward momentum that began with those few decisive days in June 1942. For those who fought at Midway, it remains a badge of honor, a legacy etched in history, though rarely acknowledged by the world at large. And yet the question remains, in the decades since, has the world truly recognized the full weight of that victory, or has it continued to be a legacy quietly carried by those who lived it? The answer lies not in the pages of history books, but in the unspoken understanding of those who were there. Midway, while sometimes lost to time, will never fade from their memory. They underestimated the U.S. once. They never underestimated them again. This simple truth, echoed in the aftermath of the Battle of Midway, became a defining moral closure to a war that would reshape the world. For Japan, Midway was a brutal lesson, one they would never forget. It wasn't simply the loss of 4 carriers or the setback to their naval power. It was the realization that the United States was not the weak, disoriented nation they had assumed. Midway was the moment when Japan's overconfidence in its dominance was finally shattered, and the cost of that arrogance was immense. In the months that followed, the echoes of Midway reverberated throughout the Pacific. Japan, though initially reluctant to acknowledge its missteps, was forced to confront the stark reality that the U.S. had proven its resilience and its ability to learn, adapt, and strike with precision. Midway had revealed a truth Japan could no longer ignore. The United States was not a nation in retreat, but a rising force. The battle was not just a military victory. It was the beginning of a profound shift in the Pacific War. It was a warning to the world of the cost of underestimating an adversary's resolve, and Japan would never be the same. Their failure to recognize the resilience of the U.S. military, the depth of their intelligence capabilities, and their capacity to turn the tide of war became their ultimate mistake. Midway marked a critical turning point in the Pacific, but its impact stretched far beyond the sinking of ships and the destruction of planes. It was the moment Japan lost its strategic initiative and the U.S. began to seize control. What had once been an unbroken line of victories for Japan now became a slow unraveling. The Battle of Midway was more than a tactical success. It was the psychological blow that shifted the momentum. Japan, having invested so much in its belief in superiority, now found itself fighting not just a military opponent, but a nation that had the capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to overcome adversity. The battle itself, fought over a small and seemingly insignificant patch of ocean, became the key moment in the Pacific theater. It was here that Japan's once unassailable naval dominance faltered. The carriers they had relied on for air superiority were no longer at their disposal. What began as a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, intended to cripple the U.S. Navy, had instead forged a resolve in America that would prove indomitable. Midway was the beginning of the end, not just for Japan's fleet, but for the very idea that Japan could control the Pacific. The U.S. would continue to press forward, island by island, driven by the lessons learned at Midway. The turning point at Midway was not just about the battle itself. It was about how it reshaped the future of the Pacific War. The U.S. Navy, emboldened by the victory, now had the initiative. Midway showed the world that intelligence, combined with the courage and adaptability of the American military, could defeat even the most formidable enemy. Japan, once confident in its strategic plans, now found itself forced to adjust to a new reality. And though they fought on for several more years, the moment they lost their advantage at Midway was the moment their fate was sealed. In the grand sweep of history, Midway was not the last battle in the Pacific, but it was the pivotal one. It set the course for the final defeat of Japan. What began as a battle fought to protect the U.S. fleet became the moment when Japan's military strategy began to crumble. The Pacific War would stretch on, but from the moment of Midway, the direction of the war was clear. Japan's defeat was no longer a matter of if, but when. Midway had turned the tide, and the final victory of the Allied forces seemed inevitable. They built it to win a battle. It ended up rewriting history. This was the lasting legacy of Midway. What Japan had intended as a decisive blow to the United States became, instead, the moment when their own downfall began. The Battle of Midway wasn't just a victory. It was a profound shift in the course of the war. And it was a lesson that would resonate for generations. Never underestimate the resolve of a nation at war, for the consequences of that mistake can change the world forever. As the war in the Pacific continued, the question remained: how long would Japan hold out against the unstoppable momentum of the U.S. forces? The answer, already written in the history books, would unfold in the coming years. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, the world had been forever altered. But for those who had fought at Midway, the full weight of their victory would only be understood in time.